All right, everyone, welcome back. This is week 9 content. This is covering the respiratory system. The respiratory system refers to the organ system that is responsible for getting air into our bodies and carbon dioxide out, as well as making sure that that air is clean, filtered, warm, and moist, which we'll talk a little bit more about in this video. Congratulations, you've probably made it through your first exam by now, but not only that, you've probably began to jump more deeply into a lot of these specialized organ functions and these specialized organ systems. So, without further ado, let's talk about the anatomy of the the respiratory system. We'll talk a little bit about alveoli, that is the site of gas exchange, and the composition of air. Gas exchange as well. We'll talk a little bit about this thing called hemoglobin. We typically know hemoglobin through blood. It's that major protein heterodimer that is within our red blood cells that helps transport oxygen. And then we'll talk a little bit about respiration, what happens when we're breathing to make us actually breathe in and breathe out. And then also innervation. So pretty much how our brain tells our body to control our breathing. So diving into the anatomy, this is the basic parts. We have our nose, our pharynx, and our larynx. Our larynx is actually our vocal cords or our voice box. So anytime you see larynx, think of that. The pharynx is this top region that sits above the trachea and helps it connect to the tongue and to the throat. So we have our nose. Obviously, our nose is where we breathe in. Right behind our nose, we have this thing called the nasal cavity in our upper respiratory tract. Our upper respiratory tract can commonly get infected when we breathe in a viral or a bacterial particle. So that's a very common thing to happen there. We also have our nasal cavity. It's a very large cavity, believe it or not. But we have a lot of good immune cells there to help us defend off things that we breathe in that may be bad. It's really responsible for getting air in there and then warming it up to the body's temperature, and then also moistening it a little bit and filtering it a little bit. This may sound weird, but you actually do have hairs in your nose and within this region. And what those hairs do is they kind of grab onto bacteria, dust, and dirt if you were to breathe those in, and then allow the air to be cleanly filtered down into your lungs. We have a lot of other ways of making sure that happens, but those are the main ways, is through nasal and oral cavity breathing. Obviously, we know our mouth is very moist as well because we have a ton of saliva. Let's look at our trachea now. Our trachea is cartilage, so it's very light and it is flexible. It can get crushed, and if it gets crushed, it's not bad because then we can't have the proper vacuum that we need to breathe in and breathe out. Sometimes if people are having this allergic reaction, their area up here in their upper respiratory tract, kind of by their pharynx, is closed off. It actually gets swollen shut in the allergic reaction. And so what you'll see people do, especially if you watch medical TV, is actually cut open this region right here so that air can still get in and out. And they'll actually put a little breathing tube down in here. The lungs contain the major organ. It might be kind of important to know that because our heart sits on our left side, or I guess your right side, that the side opposite to it, so my right side or your left side, or if you're looking at me, the left side, it contains 3 lobes when the other side contains 2 lobes. That is because we have to get rid of one of those lobes to make room for the heart to fit. So your heart fits right in between your 2 lungs, and then your lungs kind of fit around it all. So they're very, very close together. Within the lungs, you have our bronchi, and then our bronchiole and our alveoli. Think of it as the bronchi being the major tree trunks and branches, the bronchiole being the sticks, the smaller branches, and the alveoli being the leaves. Okay? Moving on. The inspiration and expiration. Inspiration means to breathe in. Expiration means to breathe out. It's kind of weird terms that we use for it. Inhalation and exhalation is another word we use for it as well. But this is what happens when we breathe in. So what's happening is our diaphragm is actually contracting. And when it's contracting, I want you to keep in mind it's pulling down. So it's not pushing into the lungs. It's actually pulling down. And when it pulls down, it's actually creating this negative pressure space that is causing air from the atmosphere to be pulled in through our nose, and through our mouths, and down into our lungs, and causing the lungs to expand. So that's what happens when we're breathing in. The ribs and the clavicle, remember clavicle, our collarbone, and the ribs, they actually move out and up. So our clavicle actually raises. You can, if you take a really deep breath, you can see it. My clavicle is raising up and my ribs are moving out. My rib cage is actually opening up and expanding just a tad in order for me to expand my lungs and increase my lung capacity for I can breathe. That's the thoracic volume. When we say thoracic volume, though, it's primarily referring to that negative pressure change. So it's that internal cavity that is increasing in size. Intrapulmonary pressure drops below atmospheric pressure. So that pretty much just means that the pressure within the lungs is lower than the pressure in the atmosphere. And when that happens, we're going to have a flow of a gas from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. That is a common entropic feature of the universe, is things like to flow from an area of higher energy. Pressure is a form of energy. Not a form of energy. It can be a component paired with energy. To an area of lower pressure or lower energy. And that's explained through this thing called Charles' Law. It states that volume and temperature are inversely proportional. So if the volume is of a reasonable state and the temperature is of a reasonable state and then it changes, those changes will be equal to each other based off entropic values. So it should all equal 0 if it's in a well-organized system. That is definitely more of a chemistry and a more physics thing. The main thing to note is that it's going from an area of higher pressure, all gas when we breathe in, to an area of lower pressure, and we're creating that lower pressure within our lungs. Expiration, we're doing the opposite. We're actually creating that higher atmospheric pressure within our lungs than the atmosphere. So that's what's helping us breathe out and push all of the carbon dioxide that we have just exchanged out. So when we breathe out, that is expiration. Those muscles are relaxing, so the diaphragm is going back up, kind of like a drum when you hit it. It'll vibrate for a bit, and then it'll go back to its resting state. That's kind of what's happening. Diaphragm relaxes, rib cage goes back down, the clavicles drop back down, so they're in depression, and then air flows out of the lungs. It goes out of the lungs, back up the trachea, out through our mouth and our nose. All right, let's talk about alveoli. So we talked about bronchi being those tree trunks, and we talked about bronchiole being those tree branches, and the alveoli are these leaves. But these are very, very special leaves. They kind of look like these weird grape nerds, gummy cluster kind of looking things. But this is the most important feature of all of the respiratory system, being that this is the site of gas exchange through passive diffusion. If you take in biology, you might have heard the term passive diffusion, but just to refresh your memory, that means that there's a higher concentration in one area and it wants to go to a lower concentration in another area. So, if we talk about things like our arteries are the oxygenated blood. They have a very high oxygen content within them. But when they reach an area where the oxygen can be dumped off, it's actually going to dump off the oxygen because it wants to have an equal distribution between the two. So if there's an area with no oxygen, an area with oxygen, they want to become even. They want to become a 50-50 split. So the air enters through the atrium, this region right here. It then diffuses, so the oxygen is pushed into because there's more oxygen in the lungs when we breathe in. So it's being pushed in, and the CO2, because there's no CO2 really on the outside, but there's a ton on the inside from our veins, the CO2 is going to be pushed out. So it makes an exchange really, really fast, and then it carries it out. And once it gets carried out, it then resets through equilibrium because we're pushing all of the other stuff out, and then we're bringing in new oxygen. And then it's just going to keep repeating. So every time we breathe in, oxygen is entering, carbon dioxide is being kicked out. And then when we breathe out, all that carbon dioxide is being kicked out. And then we're beginning to bring in new oxygen again when we breathe back in again. So it's equilibrium, it's repeating. We're dumping CO2 out, we're breathing oxygen in. Oxygen gets converted into carbon dioxide, and then it gets kicked out. All right. These are kind of some of the more structures that go along with it. Mucosal lining is kind of important because that's where we get infected. We have an upper respiratory virus. It's typically affecting and sticking into that mucosal lining. But pretty much that all those features are there to say is that it protects the things that help us exchange oxygen. It creates a moist environment. Moisture helps with movement. It creates a warm environment. We want things at the same temperature as us, and it's a filtered environment. So moisture, warmth, and filter are the three major things that the respiratory system does to air before the gas exchange occurs. And this is, again, more gas exchange that goes along with entropy. We want things to go from an area of higher temperature to an area of lower temperature so that things are eventually equal. So CO2 out, oxygen in. And this is what happens. This is our alveolus. Pretty much is the plural of alveoli. So we have our CO2 being dumped out, our O2 flows in, and then it continues on to the pulmonary vein within the heart. All right, so this is a molecule called hemoglobin. It's very interesting. It's one of my favorite molecules. Is this thing called a heterodimer. So that means it has 4 different parts, 2 parts being the exact same, and the other 2 parts being the exact same. So these alpha and our beta regions. I don't really care if you know that as much as you know that in the very middle we have an iron molecule. Basically, this is to say is that the alpha ones, they provide structural stability. So they still bind onto oxygen, but they're a little bit more stingy when it comes to giving it up. So when we're under areas that we need to dump off a lot of oxygen, it will. When beta is more a conformational change, so what it does is it opens up, kind of like your hands, and then as the gas exchange occurs, it grabs onto the oxygen, and it's more freely going to give that away. As these things called histidine residues, I don't really care that you know that. They're amino acids, so they're building blocks of proteins, and they bind proximally. So that means that they kind of bind down here in the middle to this iron molecule. So we have 1 alpha and 1 beta bonding covalently, which means it's a very strong bond, and then one of them bonding ionically, which kind of means like a magnetic kind of bond in a very simple term. You'll learn more about that if you take chemistry or even a biochemistry class very far on down the road. Lastly, we have innervation. Innervation, again, is that nervous system control. The one muscle that does all of the movement within the respiratory system is the diaphragm. The diaphragm creates this negative pressure, and it comes from the spinal cord levels. So it comes from C3, C4, C5. That means cervical nerve 3, cervical nerve 4, and cervical nerve 5. And you don't really have one that controls a single breath. They kind of all fire together. It's considered parasympathetic and sympathetic. So based off of what we need to happen within our respiratory system, certain ones fire. So if it's parasympathetic, if we're in a resting state, the airway narrows because we don't need a lot of air and it relaxes. And then if we're in sympathetic, it goes ahead and expands and there's less mucus, so less air gets caught through. And we're really just trying to get oxygen to our lungs. I attached a YouTube short in here. It does a really good job explaining and visualizing what happens when we pull down on the diaphragm in order for the lungs to expand. So if you could watch that if you have time. But really big innervation is this thing called the phrenic nerve. And we've talked a little bit about the phrenic artery or phrenic vein by now. But the phrenic nerve is pretty much just going to pulse right on that autonomically, which means that we can't stop it from firing. And that's all I have for you. So hopefully you enjoyed.